Well, good job, worship team and worship team. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. Almost hate to interrupt it with a sermon, but how many of you know you can still worship during a sermon? Okay, just checking. I invite you to turn in your Bibles to John 18. We've been here for weeks. We'll be here a few more weeks, I think. I anticipate anyway. And part of what we're doing is the same thing God did when he wrote the Gospels. Hundreds, literally hundreds of prophecies pointed right down to a 1 week period. And that's where we find ourselves. John devotes the second half of his gospel, just the last week of Christ's life. And literally on the day he was crucified, the 24-hour period, over 100 prophecies were fulfilled in one day. It's amazing. And that same God that predicted that before the world was even formed has given us almost 300 prophecies of his second coming. So if he got the first one right, I think we can trust him for getting the second one right. Jesus Christ is coming back. And it's going to come back. He's going to fulfill prophecies exactly the way he gave them to us. And there's some in this passage. But we're going to focus on the trials of Christ. If there's ever a travesty of justice, we would think this only perfect, innocent man in human history was not only found guilty, but he was tortured and executed by his own choice. It's amazing to me that Jesus Christ had, obviously many options he could have bailed out. In fact, Peter said, I've got a better plan, Jesus. You can trust me. I can get you out of this. And Jesus said, well, why would I not drink the cup that my Father has given me? That whole incredible Garden of Gethsemane, sweating great drops of blood. John doesn't cover that here, but we know from the other Gospels how Jesus, what it cost him to buy our salvation. That's why he is worthy to worship. To God be the glory. And Jesus isn't being glorified very much right now, it seems like, in the world, but let's be an exception to that. How many of you, you've heard the term kangaroo court, right? Yeah. I just found out, checking this out, thinking about how this is such a travesty and trumped up charges and all that stuff. The kangaroo court originated, it doesn't have a parallel anywhere in the world except here. And in particular, California, that's where it started. And that's where it's practiced too, but that's a different story. The gold rush, 1849, the ensuing years in the 50s and 60s, when they had claim jumpers, they would take them to a trial right away, and they would make their case, and quite often they were more anger and emotion and mob rule than law and evidence, so they became kangaroo courts, where people would be drug into a trial, and maybe the truth was shared and maybe it wasn't, but it was over the claim jumper, a person who was accused of taking somebody else's gold mine claim. And I just thought that was kind of interesting. Where else? California, right? There are 6 trials. 4 of them are mentioned here in John 18 and 19. The other 2 we're going to look at are from Luke 22 and 3. But the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all cover these trials with more or less detail than their comrades. John leaves out a couple that we're going to look at. They are very important, but for his narrative, remember John wrote his gospel years later after Matthew, Mark, and Luke had already been in circulation for a long time. And so he didn't find it necessary to do all the details that they did. But as you could see by the slide up there, they divide into 3 trials by the Jewish people, and they all find him guilty. And then there's 3 trials by the Romans, and they all find him innocent. I say Romans. Herod is thrown in there as kind of a wannabe Roman, but it's a civil trial, supposedly, instead of a religious trial. And you know the history probably as well as I do. The Jews could not They could bring a capital crime, but they could not execute the prisoner. So that's why they had to go to the Romans and say, we want this guy dead. It's interesting that all of the religious people that should have seen Jesus for who he was, if anybody got this right, you would think the Jewish leaders would have. They're the ones that found him guilty consistently. And the ones who examined the facts as well as they could be ascertained, and they were not religiously motivated, they all said, this guy's totally innocent. And yet they killed him anyway. I don't know if you could see that very well, but that's kind of the drama is taking place all around Jerusalem there. I mentioned to the first service, you know, right now there's a big controversy over 5G network. I'm going to preach a sermon on the 3G network, Gethsemane, Gabbatha, and Golgotha. That's a 3G. The Hasmonean Palace, Herod and the Herod's palace over here, and then the Caiaphas place, the temple, all that stuff. Remember, they left down here somewhere in the lower city, the upper room for dinner, and then they walked across the Kidron Valley and the Kidron Stream. Up here in the garden is where the betrayal took place, the arrest. The Roman cohort is at least 300 soldiers, perhaps more, and that's where Peter grabbed out his sword and chopped off the guy's ear, thinking 300 or 400 to 1 was not bad odds. And Jesus said, put that away. That's not why we're here. I'm here to die. And we talked about that, how Jesus predicted that Peter would deny him 3 times. It's right in the middle of one of these trials. And sure enough, he did. Didn't take very long. One of the things about being confident in your own flesh, confident in your own wisdom and strength, is that quite frequently you're humiliated. God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. And so Peter was humbled there. He went out and wept bitterly. Jesus will give him a later opportunity to be restored, because that's what God does. He's gracious. Judas also wept and was remorseful, but he did not repent to God, and Peter did. That's what makes the difference. We had a little bit of a discussion in the Sunday school this morning, and I thought Dan handled it very well. I'm of the same opinion as Dan. That's we will never meet anybody in this life that is beyond salvation. Jesus Christ died for their sins, and Jesus Christ always allows repentance and a U-turn and the opportunity to get back on track. When people resist that opportunity, that's when they get in trouble, like Judas. And he was so sorrowful that this thing kind of got out of his control and blew up in his face. He brought his bribe money back, threw it at their feet, and they said, we don't care, get out of here. And instead of repenting to God and being forgiven, he repented to them, the men, about the plan, but he never repented to God, and he went out and killed himself. How tragic. So 6 trials. The first one here is not much to speak of, but let's look at it. John chapter 18, verse 12, and goes for a dozen verses here. But so the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. By the way, just a little comment here before we're just getting started. This is why we want separation of church and state. Why in the world would the Roman cohort in the middle of the night arrest somebody and take them not to the Roman commanders, they took them to the religious leaders. In the middle of the night, it's illegal. Today, no-knock raids in the middle of the night are quite common. Back then, the Jewish and the Roman law, you didn't go around grabbing people in the middle of the night, and you certainly didn't take them to trial at dark. But here it is. This Roman cohort brought the commander and the officers of the Jews, arrested Jesus and bound him, and led him to Annas' house first. For he was father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people, and Simon Peter, remember, he was following there, and he came into the courtyard. He wasn't known by the high priest's servants, but John was. John got in, and he said, hey, can you let my buddy in, Peter in? And that was the start of Peter's downfall. But notice in verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Notice how Jesus responds, verse 20. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. These know what I said. Why is this a kangaroo court? Well, first of all, it's in the middle of the night, and it's in front of a guy who has no legal authority. Annas was the high priest 12 years earlier, but he is still pulling the strings behind the scenes. How many of you know that frequently candidates for political office are controlled by people behind them, right? People with money, people with influence. The real power brokers are not the ones you see in front of the cameras, usually. They're the ones behind the cameras, and that's what Annas is here. He was deposed 12 years ago by the Romans, said, we don't want you to be high priest anymore, we got some others. Well, the intervening 12 years, the high priests were his sons or his son-in-law. So he's still in control. And what do? The Roman cohort brings their prisoner, betrayed by a friend, and already roughed up a little bit, in the middle of the night. It's probably 2:30 in the morning by the time they reach Annas' house, and they have, hey, we got him. What do you want to do with him? Well, there's no real trial here, but what he's trying to do is to get Jesus to self-incriminate. He says here in verse 19, he questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus didn't fall for it. You want to know what I taught? Go ask the people that were there. You want evidence? Go get some witnesses. He refused to self-incriminate. By the way, if push comes to shove and we all get rounded up someday for being Christians, I recommend you do the same thing. Do not self-incriminate. Plead the fifth. It seems to work for all the liars back in Washington. And here's another thing while I'm on it. Don't turn in your brothers and sisters. It grieves me to see what's going on today among Christians, getting mad at each other. Even, people might have a different view on how to do the corona or how to vote, how to do lots of things. Christians can be different without us being angry and taking sides and accusing them of all sorts of things. So Jesus right away said, why did you ask me? There's enough evidence out there. If you want to talk to the people that I've been preaching to for 3.5 years, go ask them. And so he doesn't get any satisfaction here. But what he does is that he sends Jesus to Caiaphas. What is that? That's a green light. My son-in-law, he knows what to do. We're going to kill this guy. And so he went to Caiaphas, the next trial. Verse 25, Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas. If he was going to say Jesus was innocent, he wouldn't have been bound. Remember, the Jews are the ones that went and got the Romans to go get Jesus. That's why he was bound and arrested to begin with, is because the Jews wanted it. Now, if they would have come here and to Annas' house in the middle of the night and he didn't want Jesus convicted, he wouldn't have left him bound. Verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. All the denial stuff. And then Caiaphas is listening to Jesus in Caiaphas' house. Now he's the official high priest, which means he's the head of the Sanhedrin, which means he probably has some of those guys there at his house, and they're having a little violation of the Brown Act. They're having a meeting in the middle of the night, now maybe approaching 3 a.m., and it's not official because it's dark. It has not been convened. Not all the Sanhedrin is there, but they still are cooking up a plan. And the plan is we're going to kill Jesus. So they charge him with something that's interesting here in your fill-ins. They charged him with blasphemy. Now, that's going to cause them some problems in just a couple hours as the sun rises. So keep your finger there if you want to turn back to Luke chapter 22. This is one of the trials that John doesn't mention, but it has some very important details for us. John 22, verse 66, the sun has come up now. The first two trials were illegal just by being in the dark. They weren't officially presided over anyone. They didn't have any witnesses. They just trumped up some charges. Verse 66, when it was day. Now, just take a moment and remember, what day is this? This is the Passover. Historically, by this time, Israel has eaten the Passover lamb, and the angel of the Lord said, get ready, because tomorrow we're busting out of here. This is the day they left Egypt and started towards the Red Sea, a day of deliverance. Here, these guys are under the gun a little bit. They don't want this messiness of this trial of this rebel to mess up their party, the Passover party. And so when it was day, I mean, as soon as the sun comes up, now they reconvene the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was made up of 71 members. When they voted on convictions or some things like that, they always voted from the youngest to the oldest. A voice vote. No mail-in ballots, no hiding behind the bushes. From the youngest to the oldest. Why would they do that? Because they thought if the oldest guys voted first, the youngest guys would kiss up to them and vote the same way. So there was a voice vote from the youngest to the oldest every time. And another problem the Sanhedrin is having here is that they couldn't carry out the death penalty. And so they have to go to the Romans, and the Romans don't kill people for blasphemy. They charged him with blasphemy. They want him dead. We got to come up with something else. We got to come up with something that the Romans will be upset about enough to kill him. Verse 67, if you're the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. Now here he gives a little bit different response than he did to Annas. He's in an official Sanhedrin now. And if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask a question, you will not answer. So he knows he's not going to get a fair hearing if they enter into a dialogue. If he starts ticking off his credentials as the Messiah, none of those guys are going to say, wow, I didn't know that. What are we doing here? No, they're not even going to listen to him because Caiaphas and some of the elders, they already predetermined, prejudicially, they want to kill this innocent man. Verse 70, they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, yes, I am. Then they said, what further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it yourselves from his own mouth. Blasphemous. They are charging him with blasphemy. Now, somebody should have stopped for a minute and said, well, let's check this out. Is he the Son of God? That would have been easy to determine. He's raising the dead. He's healing people. He's casting out demons. He's checking off all the boxes that the Messiah would do this, and this. They had evidence. They didn't want it. Are you the Son of God? Yes. Oh, well then, no, we don't need witnesses. We don't need no stinking witnesses. We've heard it from his own lips. Well, yeah, he made a claim to be the Son of God. You should investigate to see if his claim is right. But they didn't do that. So they switched. As we go through here, they're going to switch from blasphemy to treason. Why? Because that's something the Romans understood. They ain't going to kill anybody over blasphemy. But boy, if you start talking about treason, you start talking about overthrowing Caesar, now you got our attention. And if you can make that stick, we'll kill him. They violated, they accused him, he broke the Sabbath, he blasphemed. They accused him of breaking the law. At least a dozen times they broke their own law in these trials. I'll give you 5 of them real quick. Trials in the middle of the night, we already talked about. Didn't call any witnesses. They condemned him based on his own testimony. They bribed false witnesses who could not agree, and they finally perjured themselves, and then prejudice and violence towards the accused. Even before he was found guilty, they beat him up. In fact, it's an interesting study here of how often he got slapped in the face, punched in the mouth, hit on the head with a big staff, and the crown of thorns was pressed down in his brow, copious amounts of blood. He already looked like a mess before they even scourged him. What kind of a trial is this? Well, it's one that God predetermined so that our Savior would feel the wrath of God against sin. Why would he do that? For me and for you. Jesus Christ took an incredible beating, torturous, felt every bit of it. In fact, when he was hanging on the cross, they offered him painkiller, and he said, no, I'm going the whole way. Why? For us. It's amazing. He's sweating great drops of blood. He was already weakened before they arrested him. And he's encountering all of this pain and torture. And Peter even tries to intervene with his sword. And Jesus said, shall I not drink the cup that my Father has given me? Jesus Christ, from before the foundation of the world, was looking forward to this moment to purchase his bride. Wow. What else is different here besides they changed the charges? But notice there's a different place. The previous trial was at Caiaphas' house. This one is in the Sanhedrin Council. There's different presiding officer, too. Caiaphas is conspicuous by his absence. He was a big shot in his house, and he was telling everybody what to do and how this was going to go down. But somehow, now the sun has come up. There's a real court being convened, and Caiaphas is silent. There's a different procedure. As I mentioned here, we don't need any witnesses. Annas and Caiaphas both wanted witnesses. Then when the Sanhedrin gets together, it's like, I'm sure Caiaphas was there. He just wasn't too prominent. But I bet he now wants these 71 guys in the Sanhedrin to hear Jesus claim to be the Son of God. He figures if they hear what I heard, they're going to believe me that we should kill this guy. Why didn't the other 69 or 70 guys investigate? So there's a different place, there's a different presiding officer, different procedure, and there's different people there. At Caiaphas' house, there's servants, there's officers, there's at least 2 disciples. There's Peter and John were in there. Might have been more. Not here. It's just the 71 Sanhedrin guys. Different people. Well, that's the Jews have had their part in this travesty. Now we're going to see the Gentiles. It's their turn, and there's 3 Roman trials coming up. Back to John 19. John 18, verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium. That wasn't very far. From where the Sanhedrin meets to where the praetorium is, just a short little jaunt. And it was early, it says, John says, so still early morning. And they themselves did not enter into the praetorium so that they would not be defiled. They're not too worried about condemning an innocent man. But they don't want to go into that Roman place, because that would mean I'd be unclean for 24 hours. I can't go to the Passover party. So they stayed out. That's how pious they thought they were. And verse 29, therefore Pilate went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, if this man were not evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. Well, that's not what he asked. You see, they're trying to bolster their case, just like they did with the 71 in the Sanhedrin. Oh, you've heard him yourself now. Now, these guys are coming to Pilate. They send a messenger in there or whatever, and he might be out on the balcony. They didn't go inside. Well, what's the accusation? Well, Pilate, we wouldn't be here if this guy wasn't evil. That's not what he asked. What is the charge? You see, for somebody to preside over a trial, somebody's got to be charged with something. There's no defense attorney. There's no witnesses. So he wants to know, what's the charge? And I should have put this in the outline too. Verse 31 is another time where Pilate tries to release him. Verse 31, so Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. Well, the Jews, notice what they said. We are not permitted to put anyone to death. So we've already concluded, not only is he guilty, but he's worthy of death. Now, what did they conclude here? He was guilty of treason against Caesar. Every one of those guys in the Sanhedrin were guilty of treason against Caesar. But they couldn't make the blasphemy result in capital punishment. So they went for the treason card, and Pilate sees right through it. Get out of here. Take him yourself and judge him. And that's one of the times he tries to release him. Here's another one, verse 38. Pilate said to him, what is truth? So he's investigating, he's asking the accused. And then the second part of 38, and when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. Isn't that interesting? Just in a little bit of an interview, Jesus came across so trustworthy and a man of integrity that Pilate concludes right away, this guy's innocent. Verse 39 does the same thing. You know, you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews? Now, it might have helped if he wouldn't have called him the King of the Jews. But look what, so they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. A robber, probably a murderer. He was, if anybody was a traitor to Caesar, this guy, Barabbas, was probably a zealot. He wanted independence for Israel. And no, give us that bad guy, and you kill the good guy. Another place, Luke chapter 23, where Pilate tries to divest himself of this innocent man. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. And oh, by the way, verse 15, neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. And behold, you remember the story where he's interviewing Jesus and he finds out Jesus is from Galilee. Oh, well, shoot, Herod's in town. He's in charge of Galilee. Let's send him over there. And Herod doesn't take him very serious, sends him back to Pilate. And therefore, verse 16, I will punish him and release him. I always thought that was one of the weirdest things. He's not guilty. No one can make a charge against him, but I'm going to punish him anyway. Why? Because of the crowd. God deliver us from leaders who don't have the backbone to do what's right instead of what the mob is screaming for. Luke 23, verse 20. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept on calling out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. So it's getting more intense, getting hard to hear. The other voices were saying, release Jesus instead of Barabbas. They're getting drowned out. That's what mobs do, people. Don't give me the facts. Don't give me any investigation. Let's not dialogue about this as sensible adults. Let's just scream at people, burn buildings, and get our way. Another one, verse 22, and he said to them the third time, why? What evil has this man done? I have found to him no guilt, demanding death. Then he says it again, I will punish him and release him. But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. Pontius Pilate is trying to appease the crowd. Maybe if I give them a little bit of blood, they'll tone down. So I'm going to beat the slop out of Jesus so bad that people couldn't recognize his face. And then he brought him out like that again. What about now? They're still screaming. We want him dead. And gradually, verse 23, their voices began to prevail. Back over to John 19, verse 4. Pontius Pilate came out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." And Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the robe. He got that robe from Herod. Herod just mocked him, laughed at him, dismissed him, put a robe on him, the crown of thorns. So Jesus is already looking horribly disfigured. So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." Well, they couldn't do that. They would have loved to do that. Grab him and go crucify him, but Roman law would not allow it. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Again, if they would have investigated, they would have come to the same conclusion. One more, verse 12. Pilate is asking him, "Do you not speak to me?" Verse 10. "Do you not realize I have the authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you?" And Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Not only was our nation founded on these kinds of laws, this idea here, that our government, our Constitution protects natural rights. It doesn't create them. Jesus is saying, yes, Pontius Pilate, you have the authority to execute criminals. You got it from my dad. The government does not give us rights. It protects the rights that God has given us. And verse 12, as a result of this, Pilate again made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out. And what are they going to do? They're pulling their traitor card again. "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It's one thing to accuse Jesus of being a traitor, and Pilate doesn't agree. But now they're implying, if you let him go, Pilate, you're a traitor, and we're going to go over your head. He's already in hot water. He's been kind of called on the carpet a couple times by the Caesar and for letting riots get out of control and not treating the Jewish people very well. And so in the back of his mind, he's saying, why don't these guys just shut up? But when they say traitor, now he knows his job is on the line. And how many of you know a lot of people in leadership that have no integrity, when it comes between their job and telling the truth, they're hanging on to their job. And that's what Pontius Pilate does here. But he tries 7, perhaps 8 times to let Jesus go. He's declaring he's not guilty. And why didn't they listen? Because Jesus is there to die. It's a travesty of justice. It's a kangaroo court. It's trumped up charges. There's no witnesses. There are illegal trials. But Jesus came to die for us. So he washes his hands of the whole matter. I'm not sure that's going to fly when he sees God on Judgment Day. But we'll see. So he's back to Pilate after he went to Herod. Pilate says, I don't have anything to do with it. Herod, by the way, we didn't look at that very long, but he's the guy that beheaded John the Baptist. He treats Jesus with contempt and mockery, puts a robe on him, sends him back to Pilate. I don't want to deal with this guy either. Get out of here. So he's back with Pilate. And notice here in verse 15, they tried to get Jesus to incriminate himself earlier. Look at this incredible statement in John 19:15. So they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Man, I never thought I would ever hear a Jew say that publicly. We have no king but Caesar. Without trying to put a guilt trip on anybody, I didn't think I would ever see Christians today roll over for the governor either. And I'm not just looking for a cheap line here. I'm concerned. Christians, we need to decide who is king. Is Caesar king or is Jesus Christ king? It's a whole lot easier to do that now in the midst of a coronavirus than to do it later when it gets really bad. We need to decide who is king. Is it Caesar or is it Jesus? Thank you. Man, verse 16, so he handed him over to them to be crucified, not to the Jews. They couldn't crucify him. He handed them over to his lieutenants, the guards, the people. Okay, grab him, get him out of here, take him over and crucify him. We didn't even look at the scourging. He mentions it just briefly in the first few verses of John 19. Pilate then took Jesus and had him scourged, and the soldiers twisted together this crown and all that stuff. They mocked him. They punched him in the face. They smote him on the head with a staff. It's our Jesus. What was Pilate trying to do? He was trying to appease the mob. Appeasement never works. We can look down through our Western history and find out when you try to appease a tyrant, it never works. Neville Chamberlain, September 30th and 38, he went over to meet with Hitler after Hitler had taken part of Czechoslovakia, and he said, we can't have this. You need to stop doing this. And you can keep Czechoslovakia, but please don't do it anymore. And Hitler says, I promise. Less than a year, Poland fell, and France was threatened, and so was Great Britain. Appeasement does not work, people. Pontius Pilate is a glaring example. Well, if I beat the slop out of him and I say, well, I find him innocent, but here, look at this bloody mess, will that satisfy you? No. People who get a taste of blood want more. And you have no business making a deal with the devil. His successor put it this way. If you will not fight for right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when your victory is sure and not too costly, you may come to the moment when you will have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival. There may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope of victory, because it is better to perish than to live as slaves. Again, I'm not trying to shame anybody, but half of the evangelicals did not vote in 2016. Now, maybe half of those figured ain't nobody worth voting for. I get it. But we can't afford to just sit here and not be engaged in our society and our culture. It is our responsibility to be the light and the salt. We've got to engage. We have to verbalize the message. We have to be visible and participating. Because It's easier to do that right now than it's going to be in a couple years. If they can tell you when to meet, when to sing, how many people to have in your church over a coronavirus, what are you going to do when they declare martial law? Everybody in here needs to ask in their heart, who is king? Who is the king, Caesar or Jesus Christ? Well, let's close with a song.